In this video, I want to talk about the scatter parameters section under distribute on geometry. The first parameter that we have here is the clone count, which we can increase and decrease. By the way, I have the display set to display points and keep points visible, which means that if the MultiCloner was deselected, I will still see the points. If I deselected that, I will not see the points, but they would, of course, render. So that's an optimization technique so that the viewport display will stay fluid and real time, while the rendering will show you the actual rendered clones. But otherwise, if you uncheck this and uncheck display points, regardless of this parameter, you will actually see the geometry. All right, so let's go back here. That's the clone count, which you can increase, decrease as much as you want. And a very good process that you can follow is to set the render count multiplier. So here I have 1000, and if I reduce the clone size, let's set it temporarily to show the geometry, because we're dealing with the clone size. So that's the clone size here, which is a multiplier of the actual clone size of the cube. So if I reduce the clone size and I set the render count multiplier to 10, I'm gonna get 10 times as much, and so forth. So this is a very good technique to use, reducing the clone count in the viewport and increasing it in the render, and playing on the clone size to get the proper scattering that you need. Now you can change the random seed, and this will randomize the distribution. So that's one way to do it. Another way to do it is to actually click on randomize MultiCloner, and this will just give you a different distribution, and change the random seed at the same time. So this is 45, 37. I can change, let's say I was testing this out until I found the proper distribution, but then I want to go back to 45, 37. I can just type the number and I would get that distribution again. Now the even spacing is very important, especially when you are distributing trees over a surface. So for that, I'm gonna go to distribution to display points, and this is what I have. I can see this from the top view as well. So let's see it from the top view. So let's see it from the top view, that way we have a clearer display. So I'm gonna go down, and now the clones have no idea of their neighbors. So they are just scattered randomly according to this random distribution that we have here. But in case I was dealing with trees and I had an overlap or two very close trees, then the distribution would not look very realistic. For example, here I would have 3 trees which are very close to each other. So how do I solve my problem? The solution is very easy. You just use even spacing. So whenever I do check even spacing, by default I get nothing, because I have to increase the search distance. The search distance is the distance that every clone is going to search for neighbors, and if it does find neighbors, it's going to change its position so that it's in an equal range from the neighbors. And this is the neighbor count, which is set to 5 by default, and the repetition of this process is called the spacing iterations, which by default is set to 10. Now these two values, you don't really have to change them all that much. What you need to change is the search distance value. So the moment you increase the search distance, magically the clones are gonna spread themselves out so that they are equally distanced from each other. So so looking at this from the perspective view, I'm gonna get this, and if I just show the points, I'm gonna get a very nice even distribution. So this is very important. If you do increase the spacing iterations, more calculations are going to be done, and therefore less overlap is going to happen eventually. But as I told you, the spacing iterations of 10 is enough. You can also increase the neighboring count calculation, but a value of 5 is more than enough. One thing to take into account also is the spacing, is the search distance multiplier. Now what does this do? Here I have 1000, and let's say the render count multiplier is 1, so I just have 1000 in total. If I render, I'm gonna get this. Now if I set this to 10,000, and I render, before I render, I see that the search distance is not good. That search distance is not good for 10,000. So in the viewport and in the render, I'm going to have unwanted overlap. So I would have to go back and change the search distance manually until I get the proper search distance. So in this case, 770 is a good value. So I'm going to undo that because there is a better way to do this automatically. So I'll keep my found search distance, which in this case is say 1600. And instead of increasing the clone count, I would actually increase the render count. And when I increase the render count, the search distance will be automatically accounted for. So if I set this to 10, so now I have a total of 10,000, then the render will give me the proper distance between the clones. Now I do have an equal distribution or equal spacing, but the clone size is getting too big for this 10,000 clone count. So here I'm going to reduce the clone size to 0.04 and give that a render, and I will see that the even spacing is still there. So the search distance would take the render count multiplier into consideration. So if I set it back to 1, I am going to get an equal spacing, and if I set it say to 20, I am still going to get the proper equal spacing because the search distance does take the render count multiplier into account. Alright, so this is for the equal distribution, which gives you a very nice result. Now sometimes whenever you have large surfaces, you're gonna increase this value and you're gonna need more than 9,999, and this is where the multiplier comes in. So if I multiply this by 10, it's gonna be 99,990. So that's just a multiplier for this value in case you cannot increase the slider to the required number. Alright, so let's go back to 1. Now, in case I do use the search distance and the even spacing, sometimes I see that some clones are getting out of the distribution geometry. Now, in most cases, this won't matter, but in case I did not want to have any clones outside, all I have to do is click on Snap to Distribution Geometry, and this will remove any clones from outside. So looking at this from the top view, if I uncheck Snap to Distribution Geometry, the distribution is not going to be exactly on the surface. It can be outside, so Snap to Distribution Geometry will ensure that the clones are exactly on the surface and none of the clones are outside. Alright, so that's the even spacing. The last parameter under scatter parameters is the distribution accuracy. So for this, I'm gonna go to my display points and I'm gonna uncheck even spacing to talk about the distribution accuracy. Now here I have a plane which has 4x4 polygons. I'm gonna make it editable, and here I see that all the polygons have the same area. So what I want to do is actually give the polygons a different area. So I'm gonna select a bunch of points and move them around, and I'm gonna drastically change the polygon areas between different polygons to see if I still get an even distribution between the polygons. In some polygons I have more points than others. For example, this triangle here does not have an even distribution as the other polygons, and this has to do with the distribution accuracy, which is an optimization value. So if I reduce this, then the areas of the polygons are not really taken into account. But increasing this value will make the distribution more and more accurate until you have a more even distribution. You can go all the way up to 1, which will give you the best distribution, but this might take some time to calculate. Therefore, it's there as a factor. In most cases, the default value of 0.05 is good in case your polygons were of similar areas, but in case they were not, as they are over here, then you might need to increase this value to get the proper distribution. So that's it for the scatter parameters. The next video will cover the transform and the randomization sections.